History is usually written by the victors, but in the case of the airplane, the story depends entirely on which map you're looking at. This isn't just a tale of wood and canvas. It is the first major patent war in modern history. In the early 1900s, two philosophies of innovation collided. On one side, the Wright brothers, secretive, methodical, and fiercely protective of their intellectual property. They saw flight as a product to be sold under the strictest control. On the other side stood Alberto Santos-Dumont, a Brazilian billionaire in Paris who viewed the sky as a shared human heritage. To him, the airplane was an open-source gift to the world, meant to be shared, not sold. December 17, 1903, the Wrights launched their Flyer over the dunes of North Carolina. It is a monumental feat, but it happens in near total isolation. No official judges, no press, and only a handful of local witnesses. While the Wrights retreated to Ohio to perfect their business model in secret, Santos-Dumont was turning the skies of Paris into a public theater. He wasn't just building a machine, he was building a legend in front of thousands. October 23, 1906. The 14 bis rolls onto the field at Bagatelle. Unlike the Wrights machine, it doesn't need a headwind or a catapult. It stands on its own wheels, ready to prove that man can defy gravity without assistance. The engine roars. The 14 bis accelerates and lifts off. For 60 meters, Santos-Dumont is suspended in history. This is the first publicly certified autonomous flight of a heavier-than-air craft. To Europe, this is the true birth of aviation. But the technicality of the takeoff would ignite a century-long feud. The Brazilian argument is biting. If you need a catapult to launch, you aren't an airplane. You're a projectile. A real airplane must be self-sufficient. The Wrights countered with physics. Their genius wasn't just the engine, it was control. They had solved three-axis control, roll, pitch, and yaw, years before anyone else. Their plane was agile, while Dumont's was stable, but sluggish. This was the spark that lit the patent war. The Wrights didn't just patent their plane, they patented the very concept of lateral control. They began a relentless campaign of litigation, suing anyone who dared to bank their wings in a turn. While the Wrights spent their prime years in courtrooms, Santos-Dumont was busy publishing his blueprints in magazines. He refused to patent the Demoiselle, his most successful design, allowing hobbyists around the world to build their own. The contrast was stark. The American startup model sought to monetize every mile flown, while the European open-source movement, led by Dumont's generosity, saw rapid, iterative technological explosions. But the war for the sky had a darker side. As the technology evolved through competition and lawsuits, the original dream began to warp. The invention that was supposed to connect continents was quickly being eyed by generals. The Wright brothers' obsession with control eventually stifled American innovation. By the time World War I arrived, the U.S. was so far behind the open European designs that American pilots were forced to fly French planes. In the end, the first patent war left two very different legacies. One gave us the aviation industry, a trillion-dollar business built on proprietary tech. The other gave us the spirit of flight, the romantic, unbridled pursuit of the horizon. History is usually written by the victors, but in the case of the airplane, the story depends entirely on which map you're looking at. This isn't just a tale of wood and canvas. It is the first major patent war in modern history. In the early 1900s, two philosophies of innovation collided. On one side, the Wright brothers, secretive, methodical, and fiercely protective of their intellectual property. They saw flight as a product to be sold under the strictest control. On the other side stood Alberto Santos-Dumont, a Brazilian billionaire in Paris who viewed the sky as a shared human heritage. To him, the airplane was an open-source gift to the world, meant to be shared, not sold. December 17, 1903, the Wrights launched their Flyer over the dunes of North Carolina. It is a monumental feat, but it happens in near total isolation. No official judges, no press, and only a handful of local witnesses. While the Wrights retreated to Ohio to perfect their business model in secret, Santos-Dumont was turning the skies of Paris into a public theater. He wasn't just building a machine, he was building a legend in front of thousands. October 23, 1906. The 14 bis rolls onto the field at Bagatelle. Unlike the Wrights machine, it doesn't need a headwind or a catapult. It stands on its own wheels, ready to prove that man can defy gravity without assistance. The engine roars. The 14 bis accelerates and lifts off. For 60 meters, Santos-Dumont is suspended in history. This is the first publicly certified autonomous flight of a heavier-than-air craft. To Europe, this is the true birth of aviation. But the technicality of the takeoff would ignite a century-long feud. The Brazilian argument is biting. If you need a catapult to launch, you aren't an airplane. You're a projectile. A real airplane must be self-sufficient. The Wrights countered with physics. Their genius wasn't just the engine, it was control. They had solved three-axis control, roll, pitch, and yaw, years before anyone else. Their plane was agile, while Dumont's was stable, but sluggish. This was the spark that lit the patent war. The Wrights didn't just patent their plane, they patented the very concept of lateral control. They began a relentless campaign of litigation, suing anyone who dared to bank their wings in a turn. While the Wrights spent their prime years in courtrooms, Santos-Dumont was busy publishing his blueprints in magazines. He refused to patent the Demoiselle, his most successful design, allowing hobbyists around the world to build their own. The contrast was stark. The American startup model sought to monetize every mile flown, while the European open source movement, led by Dumont's generosity, saw rapid, iterative technological explosions. But the war for the sky had a darker side. As the technology evolved through competition and lawsuits, the original dream began to warp. The invention that was supposed to connect continents was quickly being eyed by generals. The Wright brothers' obsession with control eventually stifled American innovation. By the time World War I arrived, the U.S. was so far behind the open European designs that American pilots were forced to fly French planes. In the end, the first patent war left two very different legacies. One gave us the aviation industry, a trillion-dollar business built on proprietary tech. The other gave us the spirit of flight, the romantic, unbridled pursuit of the horizon. History is usually written by the victors, but in the case of the airplane, the story depends entirely on which map you're looking at. This isn't just a tale of wood and canvas, it is the first major patent war in modern history. In the early 1900s, two philosophies of innovation collided. On one side, the Wright brothers, secretive, methodical, and fiercely protective of their intellectual property. They saw flight as a product to be sold under the strictest control. On the other side stood Alberto Santos-Dumont, a Brazilian billionaire in Paris who viewed the sky as a shared human heritage. To him, the airplane was an open-source gift to the world, meant to be shared, not sold. December 17, 1903. The Wrights launched their Flyer over the dunes of North Carolina. It is a monumental feat, but it happens in near total isolation. No official judges, no press, and only a handful of local witnesses. While the Wrights retreated to Ohio to perfect their business model in secret, Santos-Dumont was turning the skies of Paris into a public theater. He wasn't just building a machine, he was building a legend in front of thousands. October 23, 1906. The 14 bis rolls onto the field at Bagatelle. Unlike the Wrights machine, it doesn't need a headwind or a catapult. It stands on its own wheels, ready to prove that man can defy gravity without assistance. The engine roars. The 14 bis accelerates and lifts off. For 60 meters, Santos-Dumont is suspended in history. This is the first publicly certified autonomous flight of a heavier-than-air craft. To Europe, this is the true birth of aviation. But the technicality of the takeoff would ignite a century-long feud. The Brazilian argument is biting. If you need a catapult to launch, you aren't an airplane. You're a projectile. A real airplane must be self-sufficient. The Wrights countered with physics. Their genius wasn't just the engine, it was control. They had solved three-axis control, roll, pitch, and yaw, years before anyone else. Their plane was agile, while Dumont's was stable, but sluggish. This was the spark that lit the patent war. The Wrights didn't just patent their plane, they patented the very concept of lateral control. They began a relentless campaign of litigation, suing anyone who dared to bank their wings in a turn. While the Wrights spent their prime years in courtrooms, Santos-Dumont was busy publishing his blueprints in magazines. He refused to patent the Demoiselle, his most successful design, allowing hobbyists around the world to build their own. The contrast was stark. The American startup model sought to monetize every mile flown, while the European open-source movement, led by Dumont's generosity, saw rapid, iterative technological explosions. But the war for the sky had a darker side. As the technology evolved through competition and lawsuits, the original dream began to warp. The invention that was supposed to connect continents was quickly being eyed by generals. The Wright brothers' obsession with control eventually stifled American innovation. By the time World War I arrived, the U.S. was so far behind the open European designs that American pilots were forced to fly French planes. In the end, the first patent war left two very different legacies. One gave us the aviation industry, a trillion-dollar business built on proprietary tech. The other gave us the spirit of flight, the romantic, unbridled pursuit of the horizon. History is usually written by the victors, but in the case of the airplane, the story depends entirely on which map you're looking at. This isn't just a tale of wood and canvas. It is the first major patent war in modern history. In the early 1900s, two philosophies of innovation collided. On one side, the Wright brothers, secretive, methodical, and fiercely protective of their intellectual property. They saw flight as a product to be sold under the strictest control. On the other side stood Alberto Santos-Dumont, a Brazilian billionaire in Paris who viewed the sky as a shared human heritage. To him, the airplane was an open-source gift to the world, meant to be shared, not sold. December 17, 1903. The Wrights launched their Flyer over the dunes of North Carolina. It is a monumental feat, but it happens in near total isolation. No official judges, no press, and only a handful of local witnesses. While the Wrights retreated to Ohio to perfect their business model in secret, Santos-Dumont was turning the skies of Paris into a public theater. He wasn't just building a machine, he was building a legend in front of thousands. October 23, 1906. The 14 bis rolls onto the field at Bagatelle. Unlike the Wrights machine, it doesn't need a headwind or a catapult. It stands on its own wheels, ready to prove that man can defy gravity without assistance. The engine roars. The 14 bis accelerates and lifts off. For 60 meters, Santos-Dumont is suspended in history. This is the first publicly certified autonomous flight of a heavier-than-air craft. To Europe, this is the true birth of aviation. But the technicality of the takeoff would ignite a century-long feud. The Brazilian argument is biting. If you need a catapult to launch, you aren't an airplane. You're a projectile. A real airplane must be self-sufficient. The Wrights countered with physics. Their genius wasn't just the engine, it was control. They had solved three-axis control, roll, pitch, and yaw, years before anyone else. Their plane was agile, while Dumont's was stable, but sluggish. This was the spark that lit the patent war. The Wrights didn't just patent their plane, they patented the very concept of lateral control. They began a relentless campaign of litigation, suing anyone who dared to bank their wings in a turn. While the Wrights spent their prime years in courtrooms, Santos-Dumont was busy publishing his blueprints in magazines. He refused to patent the Demoiselle, his most successful design, allowing hobbyists around the world to build their own. The contrast was stark. The American startup model sought to monetize every mile flown, while the European open-source movement, led by Dumont's generosity, saw rapid, iterative technological explosions. But the war for the sky had a darker side. As the technology evolved through competition and lawsuits, the original dream began to warp. The invention that was supposed to connect continents was quickly being eyed by generals. The Wright brothers' obsession with control eventually stifled American innovation. By the time World War I arrived, the U.S. was so far behind the open European designs that American pilots were forced to fly French planes. In the end, the first patent war left two very different legacies. One gave us the aviation industry, a trillion-dollar business built on proprietary tech. The other gave us the spirit of flight, the romantic, unbridled pursuit of the horizon. History is usually written by the victors, but in the case of the airplane, the story depends entirely on which map you're looking at. This isn't just a tale of wood and canvas. It is the first major patent war in modern history. In the early 1900s, two philosophies of innovation collided. On one side, the Wright brothers, secretive, methodical, and fiercely protective of their intellectual property. They saw flight as a product to be sold under the strictest control. On the other side stood Alberto Santos-Dumont, a Brazilian billionaire in Paris who viewed the sky as a shared human heritage. To him, the airplane was an open-source gift to the world, meant to be shared, not sold. December 17, 1903, the Wrights launched their Flyer over the dunes of North Carolina. It is a monumental feat, but it happens in near total isolation. No official judges, no press, and only a handful of local witnesses. While the Wrights retreated to Ohio to perfect their business model in secret, Santos-Dumont was turning the skies of Paris into a public theater. He wasn't just building a machine, he was building a legend in front of thousands. October 23, 1906. The 14 bis rolls onto the field at Bagatelle. Unlike the Wrights machine, it doesn't need a headwind or a catapult. It stands on its own wheels, ready to prove that man can defy gravity without assistance. The engine roars. The 14 bis accelerates and lifts off. For 60 meters, Santos-Dumont is suspended in history. This is the first publicly certified autonomous flight of a heavier-than-air craft. To Europe, this is the true birth of aviation. But the technicality of the takeoff would ignite a century-long feud. The Brazilian argument is biting. If you need a catapult to launch, you aren't an airplane. You're a projectile. A real airplane must be self-sufficient. The Wrights countered with physics. Their genius wasn't just the engine, it was control. They had solved three-axis control, roll, pitch, and yaw, years before anyone else. Their plane was agile, while Dumont's was stable, but sluggish. This was the spark that lit the patent war. The Wrights didn't just patent their plane, they patented the very concept of lateral control. They began a relentless campaign of litigation, suing anyone who dared to bank their wings in a turn. While the Wrights spent their prime years in courtrooms, Santos-Dumont was busy publishing his blueprints in magazines. He refused to patent the Demoiselle, his most successful design, allowing hobbyists around the world to build their own. The contrast was stark. The American startup model sought to monetize every mile flown, while the European open-source movement, led by Dumont's generosity, saw rapid, iterative technological explosions. But the war for the sky had a darker side. As the technology evolved through competition and lawsuits, the original dream began to warp. The invention that was supposed to connect continents was quickly being eyed by generals. The Wright brothers' obsession with control eventually stifled American innovation. By the time World War I arrived, the U.S. was so far behind the open European designs that American pilots were forced to fly French planes. History is usually written by the victors, but in the case of the airplane, the story depends entirely on which map you're looking at. This isn't just a tale of wood and canvas. It is the first major patent war in modern history. In the early 1900s, two philosophies of innovation collided. On one side, the Wright brothers, secretive, methodical, and fiercely protective of their intellectual property. They saw flight as a product to be sold under the strictest control. On the other side stood Alberto Santos-Dumont, a Brazilian billionaire in Paris who viewed the sky as a shared human heritage. To him, the airplane was an open-source gift to the world, meant to be shared, not sold. December 17, 1903, the Wrights launched their Flyer over the dunes of North Carolina. It is a monumental feat, but it happens in near total isolation. No official judges, no press, and only a handful of local witnesses. While the Wrights retreated to Ohio to perfect their business model in secret, Santos-Dumont was turning the skies of Paris into a public theater. He wasn't just building a machine, he was building a legend in front of thousands. October 23, 1906. The 14 bis rolls onto the field at Bagatelle. Unlike the Wrights machine, it doesn't need a headwind or a catapult. It stands on its own wheels, ready to prove that man can defy gravity without assistance. The engine roars. The 14 bis accelerates and lifts off. For 60 meters, Santos-Dumont is suspended in history. This is the first publicly certified autonomous flight of a heavier-than-air craft. To Europe, this is the true birth of aviation. But the technicality of the takeoff would ignite a century-long feud. The Brazilian argument is biting. If you need a catapult to launch, you aren't an airplane. You're a projectile. A real airplane must be self-sufficient. The Wrights countered with physics. Their genius wasn't just the engine, it was control. They had solved three-axis control, roll, pitch, and yaw, years before anyone else. Their plane was agile, while Dumont's was stable, but sluggish. This was the spark that lit the patent war. The Wrights didn't just patent their plane, they patented the very concept of lateral control. They began a relentless campaign of litigation, suing anyone who dared to bank their wings in a turn. While the Wrights spent their prime years in courtrooms, Santos-Dumont was busy publishing his blueprints in magazines. He refused to patent the Demoiselle, his most successful design, allowing hobbyists around the world to build their own. The contrast was stark. The American startup model sought to monetize every mile flown, while the European open-source movement, led by Dumont's generosity, saw rapid, iterative technological explosions. History is usually written by the victors, but in the case of the airplane, the story depends entirely on which map you're looking at. This isn't just a tale of wood and canvas, it is the first major patent war in modern history. In the early 1900s, two philosophies of innovation collided. On one side, the Wright Brothers, secretive, methodical, and fiercely protective of their intellectual property. They saw flight as a product to be sold under the strictest control. On the other side stood Alberto Santos-Dumont, a Brazilian billionaire in Paris who viewed the sky as a shared human heritage. To him, the airplane was an open-source gift to the world, meant to be shared, not sold. December 17, 1903, the Wrights launched their Flyer over the dunes of North Carolina. It is a monumental feat, but it happens in near total isolation. No official judges, no press, and only a handful of local witnesses. While the Wrights retreated to Ohio to perfect their business model in secret, Santos-Dumont was turning the skies of Paris into a public theater. He wasn't just building a machine, he was building a legend in front of thousands. October 23, 1906. The 14 bis rolls onto the field at Bagatelle. Unlike the Wrights machine, it doesn't need a headwind or a catapult. It stands on its own wheels, ready to prove that man can defy gravity without assistance. The engine roars. The 14 bis accelerates and lifts off. For 60 meters, Santos-Dumont is suspended in history. This is the first publicly certified autonomous flight of a heavier-than-air craft. To Europe, this is the true birth of aviation. But the technicality of the takeoff would ignite a century-long feud. The Brazilian argument is biting. If you need a catapult to launch, you aren't an airplane. You're a projectile. A real airplane must be self-sufficient. The Wrights countered with physics. Their genius wasn't just the engine, it was control. They had solved three-axis control, roll, pitch, and yaw, years before anyone else. Their plane was agile, while Dumont's was stable but sluggish. This was the spark that lit the patent war. The Wrights didn't just patent their plane, they patented the very concept of lateral control. They began a relentless campaign of litigation, suing anyone who dared to bank their wings in a turn. While the Wrights spent their prime years in courtrooms, Santos-Dumont was busy publishing his blueprints in magazines. He refused to patent the Demoiselle, his most successful design, allowing hobbyists around the world to build their own. The contrast was stark. The American startup model sought to monetize every mile flown, while the European open-source movement, led by Dumont's generosity, saw rapid, iterative technological explosions. But the war for the sky had a darker side. As the technology evolved through competition and lawsuits, the original dream began to warp. The invention that was supposed to connect continents was quickly being eyed by generals. The Wright brothers' obsession with control eventually stifled American innovation. By the time World War I arrived, the U.S. was so far behind the open European designs that American pilots were forced to fly French planes. In the end, the first patent war left two very different legacies. One gave us the aviation industry, a trillion-dollar business built on proprietary tech. The other gave us the spirit of flight, the romantic, unbridled pursuit of the horizon. History is usually written by the victors, but in the case of the airplane, the story depends entirely on which map you're looking at. This isn't just a tale of wood and canvas. It is the first major patent war in modern history. In the early 1900s, two philosophies of innovation collided. On one side, the Wright brothers, secretive, methodical, and fiercely protective of their intellectual property. They saw flight as a product to be sold under the strictest control. On the other side stood Alberto Santos-Dumont, a Brazilian billionaire in Paris who viewed the sky as a shared human heritage. To him, the airplane was an open-source gift to the world, meant to be shared, not sold. December 17, 1903, the Wrights launched their Flyer over the dunes of North Carolina. It is a monumental feat, but it happens in near total isolation. No official judges, no press, and only a handful of local witnesses. While the Wrights retreated to Ohio to perfect their business model in secret, Santos-Dumont was turning the skies of Paris into a public theater. He wasn't just building a machine, he was building a legend in front of thousands. October 23, 1906. The 14 bis rolls onto the field at Bagatelle. Unlike the Wrights machine, it doesn't need a headwind or a catapult. It stands on its own wheels, ready to prove that man can defy gravity without assistance. The engine roars. The 14 bis accelerates and lifts off. For 60 meters, Santos-Dumont is suspended in history. This is the first publicly certified autonomous flight of a heavier-than-air craft. To Europe, this is the true birth of aviation. But the technicality of the takeoff would ignite a century-long feud. The Brazilian argument is biting. If you need a catapult to launch, you aren't an airplane. You're a projectile. A real airplane must be self-sufficient. The Wrights countered with physics. Their genius wasn't just the engine, it was control. They had solved three-axis control, roll, pitch, and yaw, years before anyone else. Their plane was agile, while Dumont's was stable but sluggish. This was the spark that lit the patent war. The Wrights didn't just patent their plane, they patented the very concept of lateral control. They began a relentless campaign of litigation, suing anyone who dared to bank their wings in a turn. While the Wrights spent their prime years in courtrooms, Santos-Dumont was busy publishing his blueprints in magazines. He refused to patent the Demoiselle, his most successful design, allowing hobbyists around the world to build their own. The contrast was stark. The American startup model sought to monetize every mile flown, while the European open-source movement, led by Dumont's generosity, saw rapid, iterative technological explosions. But the war for the sky had a darker side. As the technology evolved through competition and lawsuits, the original dream began to warp. The invention that was supposed to connect continents was quickly being eyed by generals. The Wright brothers' obsession with control eventually stifled American innovation. By the time World War I arrived, the U.S. was so far behind the open European designs that American pilots were forced to fly French planes. In the end, the first patent war left two very different legacies. One gave us the aviation industry, a trillion-dollar business built on proprietary tech. The other gave us the spirit of flight, the romantic, unbridled pursuit of the horizon.
In the end, it wasn't a fight about who flew first, but how we chose to fly. One chose the path of the mogul, the other the path of the martyr. One gave us a tool, the other gave us a wingspan. History remembers the first, but the world loves the second.
Who really won? Perhaps the answer isn't a name, but the fact that we can even ask the question while sitting in a pressurized cabin 7 miles above the Earth. The sky is the only trophy that matters.